to the TLDR or TILDA, short, snappy insights from our in-house experts on a range of topical themes that are being discussed within the research community. Now, we love a good deep dive into the awkward challenges and innovative solutions that are transforming the world of academia and industry. And today we're discussing an interesting new initiative that's been making waves in the research community, ERROR. Inspired by bug bounty programs in the tech industry, Error.Reviews offers financial rewards to those who identify and report errors in academic research. Error has the potential to revolutionize how we approach, among other things, research integrity and open research by incentivizing the thorough scrutiny of published research information and enhancing transparency. So to discuss this topic, I'm joined by Dr. Leslie McIntosh, who is the founder of Repater, the AI-enhanced research integrity tool that's now part of Dimensions. Leslie is now VP of Research Integrity here at Digital Science. I'm also joined by Dr. Mark Hahnel, who is the founder of Figshare, the open research information repository that enhances the visibility of all research outputs and adds value to collaboration by making objects citable. Mark's now the VP of Open Research at Digital Science, and I am refereeing this deliciously nerdy conversation. I'm Dr. Suze, a former academic chemist and now Director of Researcher and Community Engagement, also here at Digital Science. So we're going to kick off our conversation with some opening thoughts from Leslie and Mark on what ERROR means to research integrity and to open research. Leslie, you're going to shed light on how Error.Reviews can bolster trust and credibility in scientific findings, and Mark, you're going to explore a little bit about how this initiative aligns with the principles of open research and how all these things can drive a culture of collaboration and accountability. And I'm then going to ask you a bunch of questions so that we can find out a little bit more about the impact that ERROR could have on the research community and beyond. So Leslie, let's kick off with you. I'd love to hear your initial thoughts about ERROR and the impact that it can have on the research community in terms of research integrity.
Yeah, thank you, Suze. Always lovely to chat with you, and thanks for having me on here. My initial thoughts were actually a bit counter to one another. On the one hand, you really want to see science and research integrity, science being strengthened, research integrity being looked at, errors being inspected within science. But there's the other part of me that goes, okay, what are unintended consequences for this? And I am speaking about the program now because I think you're also going to ask about the Wired magazine coverage of it, which I have a little bit different take on this. So here's what I'm thinking of now. I mean, we're looking at moving into checking on science, finding the errors, and but are we making it too efficient? I guess is my thing. Errors are part of science and part of the discovery. And the thing that I think about is market efficiency. And I'm from the States. And so I come from the idea of that standardizing things in the food industry, there's a market efficiency, right? But one of the consequences of that is that, okay, everything tastes the same, everything is consistent, but you lose nutrients. You actually have very unhealthy practices within individuals' eating habits within the United States. And I'm not saying that's all because of market efficiency, but there are consequences to this market efficiency. So are we going so deep into science and saying that everything has to be perfect that we're losing the greater meaning of what it is to search for truth or discovery and understand that there's learning in the errors that we have? So that's one aspect. The other aspect I'm just going to bring out in this is, and love to hear Mark's take on this, is open science means that it's open to interpretation and to influence. So this is not just a conversation between the author and those that are finding the errors, but it is a conversation or an influence of people outside of science that can twist and weaponize the narrative that will happen here, such as saying that science can't be trusted because we're finding those errors, when in fact, anyone who's worked in science knows that error is part of it. It's part of the fun, honestly, and the excitement, and we need to have that. So those are my two initial opening thoughts. Thank you.
I think you make some really interesting points and some very interesting provocations. And actually, I think the thing that you talk about, the deliciousness of errors, the number of times you hear stories in scientific research and in innovation of things that went wrong or things that were left over the weekend and people came back and actually discovered something very new. But I suppose what we're talking about here is sort of the errors in reporting as well. So, Mark, I wonder whether I can come to you for your opening thoughts. What does error.reviews mean, and what do these kinds of tools mean for open research?
Yeah, thanks, Suze. Thanks for having me. I think it's really interesting to hear Leslie's point of view first because it always I like to think of things at very much at the macro scale, and the devil is always in the detail. But I think for one, I'm excited because I think that if we're looking from an open research angle, one of the benefits of open research is we can move further faster and remove any barriers to building on top of the research that's gone beforehand. And so you need a few things for that. One of the things you need, the most important thing you need is trust. And trust is more important than speed of publication, than how open it is, some might argue, um, and the cost effectiveness of the dissemination of that research. And so I think one of the most interesting areas that we're seeing in the last 5 years this change in is how do we solve the problem that is peer review? And we're seeing so many new initiatives, and that's why I'm excited because I just love to see people trying things. Because if we don't try the things, then we won't move the needle on this. And so I am excited about the approach. I am excited about the many eyes make all bugs shallow approach from academic software and software in general. And it's almost flipped the model there. So I also like the idea of payment for your work, and I think the payment for the work is the most interesting part for me because when we look at academia and perverse incentives in general, I'm excited that people are being paid for their work, that academics who are often not paid for their work are being paid for their work in academic publishing. I mean, um, but then that comes right back around to where Leslie started, and show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes, and you start these new ways of incentivizing people to work. You start financial incentives, and you may see some unwarranted or unexpected consequences. So excited, uh, optimistic, but cautious.
Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, Mark. I think you make some really interesting points and provocations. I think particularly the point you make about work being done by academics. Academics do a huge amount of work to make this system happen, to make the system work. And a lot of it actually is very much overlooked. And so I suppose paying people to do some of this work is one way that we can start to acknowledge and add value for some of this work. But of course, that does come with challenges because the moment that you start to incentivize something financially, there can be kind of gamification of the system for various reasons. So I would love to ask you both a few more questions to do a bit of a deeper dive into this topic. And I'm going to come to you first, Leslie. I wonder, maybe reflecting on this incentivization, can you discuss the potential ethical concerns and considerations that we should have with this bounty system and how you think they should be mitigated?
Great question. I'm going to talk about let me talk about a couple of ethical issues. One is this whole idea that it's a bounty hunter it just makes me cringe. That generally, and maybe it's just from my perspective because there were American shows about bounty hunters and it's people going after criminals. Scientists are not, people who make errors are not criminals, right? It's we're talking about honest errors. I'm not talking about all of the nefarious things that are intentionally done either within or outside of science. That is something different, and I don't think that's what this program is about. So I just want to be clear, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who make honest errors are not criminals. That is part of science. So I really think that ethically, when we are using a term like bounty hunters, bounty researchers, it connotes a feeling of criminalization. And I think there are some ethical concerns there with doing that, because that's, I mean, what this program is about is actually working within psychology, right? If you go in and you read where they're looking. And I think that's interesting because that is a psychological mind play to use a term like that. I know it's sexy. I know that, Wired will get picked up more if it uses terms like that. But it's not, I don't think it's upstanding, and I think something else should be looked at. The other thing that I just want to bring up in the global context is this seems very much like a global north white man initiative, which in fact, if you look at who started it, that is who's in that. Now, I know that they have set up, and I think that they're trying to mitigate the politicalization or the going after certain researchers because they are not liked. I have a concern about that to ensure that that's upheld. But what does this do for researchers who maybe aren't accustomed to reporting their work in the same way that wealthier research teams are, because there are pockets of under-resourced researchers within the global north as well as resourced within the global south. So I don't want to say that doesn't exist. But what are they doing to ensure that this is from a global perspective and not just from a very resourced perspective, trying to use money for other resourced people to incentivize them? Um, what I do think that they have put some things in place. I do think that diversifying the board and diversifying the oversight would help on some of this. As far as the financial incentive, I agree with Mark, though. I mean, there's so much work that's done where you're not financially paid for doing hard work. And so there is that. The one other thing I'm just going to add now, and maybe add a question about this before, is that one of the things. Actually, I will stop. Let's go to Mark, and then I'll come back. I have an idea of errors.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you talk about things like language, for example, and the term bounty hunting. We know that language is incredibly important. We did some research alongside the ISMPP conference about using hype words in titles and abstracts of papers. We know that language matters, that it will be perceived or picked up, and these things fall along demographic lines as well in terms of who uses them and who engages with that kind of language. So I think you make a really good point there. I also think, as you said, errors are a very human thing to do. They're part of research as well. We kind of fail in order to succeed again and again, iteratively. And so I do think there is that aspect that you don't want to take out of this. But I suppose what we're sort of talking about here specifically is the misreporting, the errors in reporting what's been done. Now, I think you also make a great point about inclusion and, the global south, for example. There is huge inequity, even, in the global north, in particular institutions that may be financially rich but don't have wealth in terms of being able to share experience and knowledge and the rules of the game. And so I think accessing that support is incredibly unequal at the moment. Now, given that open research is inclusive and on a very global scale, Mark, I'd love to ask you, what challenges do you sort of foresee in integrating a system like this alongside existing open research practices?
Yeah, thanks, Suze. I think Leslie makes some really good points on the concept of just how big academic research is. It's global. There's subjective norms in different countries, different regions, different subjects. And so it's very hard to, if you can apply many different lenses and get many very different viewpoints. And I think that's why it needs a discussion. That's why, I mentioned the payments incentive. I, for one, think all peer review should be paid, and that's something that is relatively controversial in the conversations I have. We could speak for hours about that because of the many. Like, what does it mean for financial incentivization in countries where the economics is so disparate? But I think when we think about the different lenses, for me, the thing that's exciting about this is where we are with feeding information into machines. And I think the equity discussion and the kind of almost like a pilot nature of it, they're going to do 250 papers over the next 4 years. They're paying 1,000 francs, which is a considerable amount. We can talk more about how that scales up and who pays for it and whether there's a return on investment there. And I think if you're looking at who pays for it and where the return on investment is, I think it's really at the level of, can we create content that is trustworthy to be assimilated by these large language models that we're seeing, and trying to use the humans and the machines to move further faster. The advances in AI with open research, open data, things like DeepMind at the moment have largely focused on really homogeneous data sets with homogeneous metadata standards. And I think where it gets more risky right now, and where it gets harder to do well, or where you might get compounding errors, is looking at the full text and is looking at the really great context that Leslie was talking about before as being the really interesting thing. It's a researcher's story of how they got their data. The context is always going to be the king or the queen, and the paper is always going to be the central point because of that reason. So the question for me is, how do we normalize that in a way that then makes it so machines who don't care about subjectiveness or context can just get accurate facts and eat them up? And I think this is really exciting, because it's a way to say we are improving, enhancing the quality of the content that is out there. And then again, that just brings back to the fact, well, what about the people who do not have access to this, and therefore their content doesn't get included in the large language models and doesn't go on to form new knowledge? And so, as I say, I think it's a really interesting thing, and it's a global perspective with academia, and there's many different lenses, and different people think that the different parts are the most important things to fix first. I'm kind of cool with the idea that we will fix the different things in different ways at different times. And I'm excited about the enhancement of some research, if not all research.
Yeah, some really great points, Mark. And it's nice to see alignment and agreement in what you're both saying, but also see how these different challenges require some very specific considerations to be made. So, Leslie, what would you like to see from a tool like Error? What is missing, do you think?
So, thank you. And I'm so glad I waited until after Mark spoke, because I now have two thoughts on this. So here's a thought. If you go back to Alexander Fleming's paper on penicillin and read that, it is a story. It is a story of the errors that he had. It was the story of what he, and I'm sure it wasn't just him, other people were testing in the lab, and going into that mind, that exploration of why this didn't work. What led me to the path of this discovery? And those errors were part of, or are part of, that seminal paper. It's incredible, right? So my thought was, well, why not celebrate the errors and put those as part of the paper? Actually celebrate, talk about, we tried this, and you know what? The refrigerator went out, during this time. And here's what we learned from the refrigerator going out is that the bugs still grew or whatever it was, right? The other thing, kind of tying into what Mark was saying, when you're building algorithms, you need stuff that isn't what you're training your model on. So you need those errors in order to learn from the errors, meaning you need those captured, right? So that you can learn what is and what is not contributing to that overall goal and why it isn't. So we actually need more of the information of how things went wrong and those errors. So if that could be captured, I think it would be a neat way to really broaden this initiative that they have. So there's my thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know that we all believe that we must share negative results. They're just these iterative steps towards research success. I actually have a patent on something that came about through those exact circumstances. So, let's not lose that in the reporting of the research that is done. But I wonder, Mark, from the open research perspective, then what improvements would you like to see? What would you keep and what would you like to change in a tool like Error?
Yeah, as I said, I think it's really the when you have different people with different approaches, then there's always kind of other areas that you can look at and see where the success is. And a part of this might be coming from my frustration of um, with open data and with generalist repositories and wanting to improve the way in which researchers describe the content that they're sharing and giving it good metadata. And I think the analogy to the open source software world of this, bug hunting and I am going to make my code open source and I'm going to make it open source in a way that I want other people to reuse it because that makes the impact of my work greater. And so you get every GitHub repository or GitLab or Bitbucket, whichever one you want to use, has a README which says this is how you use this. This is the context, and it's not as detailed as a paper. But I think that means that anybody anywhere can come along and build on top of that work that's been done. And that doesn't happen particularly in the open data space because of a lack of metadata. And so it does happen more so in papers because of the context, because of the story. And so my thinking is how can we kind of bring both of those approaches, particularly to the open data world, and the way that this is looking at things to look for the errors and look for um, a thorough statistical review. On the one hand, it's kind of when I was reading the Wired paper that the Wired article that we've referenced, when I was reading about it, I was thinking, well, isn't this what peer review should be? But it's almost like we've gone above and beyond peer review, and we need to pay someone to do a really, really thorough job. And that for me just highlights what's wrong with peer review. I think when you're seeing new models, we're seeing eLife saying, we want fast research. So you get the preprint published and then you get the peer review on top of it. And you make the peer review open. So you're not, it's less obvious if you've got your PhD student to do your peer review for you because you're busy as a PI. And so I like the idea that people are bringing approaches from different worlds. I like the idea that this is going to enhance the content. But yeah, as Leslie says, I mean, my point about large language models, and if we only have this is all good stuff and you have it nothing, here's the negative data, the null results to back check against, um, then you're going to have more problems compounding in the AI world and the way in which we report things as facts, and facts are very rarely facts for forever. Um, so I think it's a move in the right direction, and I think the bigger problem is how we report this as this is flawless data, because we already say that if you're published in Nature, it's flawless, and we see retractions in Nature, and we see the incentive structure going awry at times, and the incentive structure of only publishing novel research uh, in certain journals is builds into that. You know, the idea that you're not going to publish your null data because it's not novel, and the incentive structure isn't there. So, as I said, could talk for hours about why I'm excited about it. Um, but yes, there's I think the errors review team have a lot of things to unpack.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned metadata and, of course, this incentive structure, the way that we categorize and reward so called successful research, because that really still drives so many aspects of research culture. So I'd like to ask both of you for your take home thoughts on this topic. What would you like the research community to take from this? What would you like to see from a tool like Error that would better support your areas of expertise, in research integrity and in open research? Leslie, I'll come to you first.
I would say where I would like to see more emphasis is more on the science communication edge, not within science, right? But knowing the narrative and holding the narrative on what this does for science, what it doesn't, and what science is about. Because Mark brought up the point of peer review, and we're supposed to have peer review. And I can tell you one of the ways in which science is being weaponized is to say peer review is dead. Now, what happens when you say peer review is dead is that then you start breaking apart one of the scaffolds of trust that we have within science. It's not the end all be all as we all know it. It needs to be strengthened. But if you are looking at a weaponization and trying to weaken the whole narrative of the scientific ecosystem, that is one place that's being attacked because it's one of the strongest places that we have. So I think that the science communicators here are very important in the narrative of what this is, what it isn't, and what science is.
Thanks, Leslie. That's some great comments. And Mark, what are your take home thoughts on tools like Error through the lens of openness for the research community?
Yeah, I just to echo what Leslie was saying there, I think I've talked about this. I think if we're looking for optimal dissemination of academic content, we want that fast, open, trusted, and cost effective. And I think the most important one there, particularly in a post-COVID world, um, is trust. And when you pull on one of those things, the others move. So, preprints are fast, cost effective, and open, but they need that level of trust before we put it into the
Mm.
real corpus of academic literature. And so this is where I was excited at the beginning. Anything that's looking at improving the trustworthiness of academic research so you can counter those uh, naysayers or the people who have ulterior motives to try and distrust academic research. I think any innovation is great, and I think if you're listening to this or reading this and you think there's ways in which you do it better, then go and do it because we need more innovation. Anything that is innovating in the space is a good, because my biggest concern about this is how does it scale, right? 1,000 francs a pop is 250 papers. There was 2 million papers last year. Who's going to pay for that? How do you make this global? How do you make this all encompassing? And I think if 1,000 different initiatives that tried 1,000 different things, one of them probably will scale. It might be this one. The funders might decide it's the most important thing. So I think more things like this equals good.
I really love that you're throwing down the gauntlet for more inclusive innovation in this space. I mean, if that's not a pitch for our Catalyst Grant program, I don't know what is. Leslie, Mark, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this topic. I think it's clear from this discussion that, Error.reviews represents a significant step forward in experimenting in enhancing both research integrity and open research through this bug hunting incentivized system. Leslie's highlighted how the initiative can act as a robust safeguard, ensuring that research findings are more thoroughly vetted and reliable. But she does remind us that we need to be inclusive in this approach. Mark has also emphasised the potential for a tool like this in making publication processes more efficient and even finally rewarding researchers for all the additional work that they're doing. But he does wonder how this can scale up to foster a more transparent and collaborative research environment that aligns perfectly with the ethos of open research as well. Leslie and Mark both agreed that while there are challenges to be addressed, the overall impact of a tool like ERA could be transformative and could really help create a culture where rigorous scrutiny and shared responsibility drive the advancement of knowledge. By incentivising error detection and encouraging openness, Error.Reviews stands to strengthen the foundation of academic research, ultimately benefiting the entire research community and society at large. But we must be mindful that there are risks to this, particularly to already marginalised groups. Thanks so much for joining us on this TLDR deep dive, where we share our thoughts on some of the most exciting and innovative topics being discussed across the research community. We look forward to exploring more innovations and initiatives that are going to shape or shatter the future of academia. So if you'd like to suggest a topic we should be discussing, please let us know. We'll see you next time.